Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to look at labour markets. We're going to look at labour markets particularly in an Australian context, but the economic theory is going to be relevant to wherever you're studying labour markets in the context of economics. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what a labour market is. We're going to have a look at the different ways that wages can be determined and conditions in the labour market. And then we're also going to have a look at this issue of a decentralised versus a centralised labour market. So these are all the things we're going to cover in this video on labour markets. All right, let's get started. So our first place to start is to talk about what a labour market actually is. And the best way to think about it is to go back and back to looking at sort of market equilibrium and to think about the distinction between a product market and a factor market. Now, if this is confusing to you, don't even worry, we're going through it right now. So let's think about it this way. A product market is the market for goods and services. This is where goods are sold by firms and they are bought by consumers. So in a product market, which you can see over my shoulder over here, that demand is represented by consumers. They demand goods and services, and then, would you believe, supply is determined by firms. They, supply goods and services. So in this graph where demand and supply intersect, that is the equilibrium price for a good or a service. Very important to note though that demand, the wanting of the stuff comes from consumers, supply, the production of the stuff comes from firms. So this is a product market. But when we talk about labour markets, this isn't a product market anymore, it is a factor market. And factor market, look over there, the factor market being like the factors of production, a resource, because that's what labour is. So when you look at the graph for a labour market, that the supply in this market, the supply of labour, that doesn't come from firms. Firms don't supply workers, people supply their labour. So the supply of labour comes from people in the economy. Then the demand in the labour market, the demand is for labour. And then you can see, firms demand labour. People don't demand labour, they supply labour. Okay, so now we talk about how wages and conditions can be determined in a labour market. And essentially what we're talking about is two different concepts or two different kinds of approaches. So on one side, you've got what's called a centralised labour market. And the best way to think about this is the idea of having something that is central or centralised, is that you've virtually got one group that is determining the wages and conditions. It is determined in a central location. So a centralised system is where the government is essentially setting all the wages and conditions for people in the labour market. And then also, if you think about it, the kind of tool that is used in this labour market in Australia is something called an award. An award setting the minimum wages and conditions for a worker. In a centralised system, everyone's pretty much on an award because the government is setting their pay and conditions. So that is a centralised system, and that is the very extreme of a centralised system. If you then consider the other situation, on the other extreme, there's the decentralised system. So if you've got the centralised system where everything is being made in a central location, if you have a decentralised system, it is kind of the opposite of that. So wages and conditions are no longer being determined wholly by the government. Instead, wages and conditions are being determined at the enterprise or company level, that businesses are sitting down with their workers and sorting out their own pay and conditions. You've got a whole bunch of different decisions that are being made across the labour market because the government isn't in control of wages and conditions in this type of system. So what you've got is a whole bunch of agreements being made in individual workplaces, and these can be enterprise agreements where they're being made across the company, typically negotiated by the enterprise's union and the company itself. So there's that enterprise agreement. It applies to everybody in that workplace. Or you might have individual contracts where you've got really high income earners with really strong skills sitting down and negotiating their own pay and conditions individually with their employers. Now, the idea of sort of enterprise agreements or enterprise bargaining, that whole enterprise level, or individual agreements, that's not possible under a centralized system, because in a centralized system, the government is running the show, whereas in a decentralized system, there are a whole bunch of other individual decisions being made between employers and employees. Okay, so now let's look at the pros and cons of this idea of a decentralized system. And the context you should be aware of is that Australia for a long period of time was a highly centralized, highly regulated labour market. So in terms of our discussion here, let's think about what are the pros and cons of a move to a more decentralized system. So I think from an economist's perspective, the most important part of a decentralized labour market is there is incentive for workers to work harder, because they know that if they work harder, they can get better wages and conditions, because they can go to their individual employer, and what they can do is they can trade off productivity increases for higher wages and better conditions. So basically, a decentralized system can encourage greater productivity and output in an economy because workers have an incentive to work harder. Let me paint the opposite picture. Imagine that everybody in your workplace gets paid the same amount of money, gets the same conditions, and it's up to the government to determine whether everybody gets better wages and conditions or no one gets them. There's not really any economic incentive for you to work any harder, because you know that even if you work harder than the person next to you or the person over here, you're all going to get the same amount of money or the same conditions. Not a lot of incentive here. So in a decentralized system, this is the language we use. Workers can trade off productivity increases for better wages and conditions. Now, another advantage of a decentralized system is that when the economy goes through a downturn, employers don't have to fire a whole bunch of workers. Because employers control wages and conditions, or have a large hand in determining wages and conditions, what they can do is they can say to their employees, we're going through a tough patch. What we're going to do is we're going to reduce your wages and conditions, or we're going to give you fewer hours, but you keep your job. Because there is flexibility to determine wages and conditions. In a centralized system, there is none of that flexibility. So basically, everyone would have to be fired because employers can't change their wages and conditions. So what we can say is that a decentralized system could help to reduce the level of unemployment during an economic downturn. This is a possibility. Okay, one final advantage of a decentralized system is that resources, labor, can be more efficiently allocated. And what I mean by that is that firms, if they really need extra workers, they can offer them better wages and conditions and attract them to their industry, and then use those resources in growing industries where they are most needed and take them away from industries that aren't doing that well. If everybody gets the same wages and conditions, firms can't attract resources away from industries that are pretty hopeless. So what we can say is that the ability of firms to offer differing wages and conditions can attract workers to growing industries and result in a more efficient allocation of resources, putting resources to their best use in terms of increasing output in the economy. Okay, now let's look at a few cons in terms of a decentralized system. I think the major con from an economic and a social perspective is that this kind of system can increase inequality. This is because some workers who have great skills can argue for higher wages and conditions, while workers that don't have the same in-demand or level of skills are going to earn less money and have worse conditions. So there could be an increasing in income and wealth inequality because of this decentralized system that is more flexible in an economy. Another disadvantage is that because wages are set at an enterprise level, that if certain workers in in-demand industries are arguing for higher wages and employers give them those higher wages, well then that could increase inflationary pressures in an economy. Because in a centralized system, in the other system, that the government is setting wages and conditions, so isn't going to let wages run away in terms of inflationary pressures. But in a decentralized system, some workers may be arguing for higher wages, employers could give them those higher wages, cost push, inflation, which could then result in higher inflationary pressures in the economy. And that kind of relates to the final point, that in a centralized system, the government can use wages as an economic tool because it can say, oh, inflation's rising, let's just reduce everyone's wages, or let's not offer everyone wage rises, even though they're asking for it, which can then help reduce inflationary pressure. Okay, so this was a discussion about how labour markets work, particularly the Australian context, and this issue of a centralised versus decentralised system. Make sure you can draw the graphs in terms of a labour market and you're aware of these elements of pros and cons of shifting to a decentralised system. All right, put your questions in the comments, and as always, thank you very much for watching.